Well, it's a great honor and pleasure to have Professor Predrag Cicovacki visiting again. So it's not the first time that we've been hosting our guest this evening. After receiving a BA in philosophy at the University of Belgrade, Professor Cicovacki came to the United States in 1986 to study Kant with the very eminent scholar of Kantian philosophy, Louis White Beck, at the University of Rochester. Since 1991, he's been teaching philosophy at a private Jesuit college, the College of Holy Cross, at Worcester, Massachusetts, where he's also served as the Director of Peace and Conflict Studies and as Editor-in-Chief of Diotima, a philosophical review. He became full professor in 2009 and is now Professor Emeritus at Holy Cross and a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge, affiliated with the College of Peterhouse. Professor Cicovacki was also a guest professor at the University of Freiburg, Germany, 1998 to 99, the Center for Applied and Professional Ethics, the University of Moscow, the Henry J. Lear Luxembourg Program at Luxembourg, University of Belgrade, Benares Hindu University, and Pondicherry. Over 125 of Cicovacki's articles and essays are published in or translated into English, Serbian, German, Russian, Spanish, Slovenian, Macedonian, Chinese, and Japanese. He's the author of 12 books and the editor of 11. His latest books are God, Man, and Tolstoy, New York, 2022. I think we heard a part of that a couple of years ago. And The Meaning of Life, a quick immersion, 2021, which is also translated into Russian, Spanish, Chinese, Serbian, and Macedonian. So thank you very much for speaking with us this evening.
Thank you for having me again. It's an honor to be here, privilege. Today I'll be talking about Platonism and Transcendence. To begin with, I would like to remind you of a later book of Homer's Odyssey, specifically about the meeting of Penelope and Odysseus. Just to refresh your memory a little bit, in Iliad we have Odysseus and other Greek heroes depart for the war, for the Trojan War that lasted 10 years. And then in the Odyssey we have his wandering home that lasted another 20 years. So imagine a husband and wife who have not seen each other for 20 years. In fact, Penelope has no evidence that Odysseus is even alive. The man, Odysseus, who appears in Ithaca, back to the island where he was the king, is dressed as a beggar. He goes around under a different name. He claims to have known and hosted Odysseus even to the face of his wife. So there's a long preparation for the moment when Odysseus and Penelope will face each other, will sit face to face, when they have to recognize each other as husband and wife. It's one of the most fantastic episodes, or series of episodes really, in the history of Western literature. And it sounds very Platonic to me, as I will try to explain to you, even though to my knowledge, Plato does not mention anywhere explicitly that particular part of Homer's opus. What I will try to show is that with the help of this episode and my interpretation of it, that in our very anti-Platonic and anti-metaphysical age that we live in right now, not only that there's a room for Platonism, but there's a fundamental necessity to revitalize Platonism yet not the latter of Plato, but Platonism in the spirit of a very different age and civilization of which we are part right now. I will try to do that. My lecture will be scheduled on basically three elements, which I think are common to both Platonism and Transcendence, which I will try to interpret in my own way, and which I hope will enable us to see that Platonism is a viable philosophical and not just philosophical doctrine, and that indeed we very, very much need Platonism for our sanity and for our orientation in life today. The first element that I will be discussing is the moment of recognition. The moment of recognition. Penelope and Odysseus have to recognize each other. Homer does a masterful job in introducing several layers of possible recognition. If you recall the Odyssey, the first, I cannot say person, the first being to recognize Odysseus disguised as a beggar is his dog. The second person to recognize Odysseus is his old nanny, who recognizes the scar while bathing him, while washing him. What is important about this meeting of Penelope and Odysseus is that they have to recognize each other at a different level, not at the factual level, not at the level of fingerprints or birthmarks or scars. To explain that difference just a little bit, we can make a distinction, which I think is very implicit in Homer and which is very important for Plato, between mere facts and subtle truths. Mere facts and subtle truths. What Penelope especially wants, it's a little bit easier for Odysseus because he knows where he came to. He knows that that is his wife Penelope, but she doesn't. The task of recognition is really on her side. Is the stranger really her husband? Is the stranger not just Odysseus in the physical sense of that word, but her husband, the man she loved? Not someone with whom she engaged in a social contract of marriage, not just someone who would be physically the identical person. Because we all know in our time, perhaps better than people did know in Homer's time, but Homer was aware of it, what a war can do to people. They come back from war, but they're broken. They're not the same people that left for that war. What Penelope has to figure out was not, is that the same physical being, but is that the same spiritual being? Is that her husband in the true sense of the word? That's the beauty of that episode. That's the challenge of that episode. And that already gives you an element of Platonism, because Platonism is not about mere facts and the recognition of facts. We will talk about it just a second. So I'm using the word recognition, that's indeed in Homer. As you know, Plato was talking far more frequently about words like anamnesis, remembering things. But in our age, just about the only thing we have to remember are multiple passwords that we have for various websites that we are using. That's just about the only thing that we have to remember. Everything else is in our phone or in our computer, and we can simply check it. What about this word recognition? Recognizing something. Notice the first part of that word, this Latin prefix re. It always means a repetition of a kind, going through something that already happened before, not cognizing, but recognizing, becoming familiar with it once more, and perhaps at a little bit deeper level than the first time, right? So another important aspect of this distinction between mere facts and subtle truths could be explained in this way, in terms of the following distinction. Facts are about the way the world is. Some truths are true to something in a world or someone in a world. So what Penelope has to recognize is whether Odysseus stay true to her, stay true to Ithaca, stay true to being the king of a very proud nation and a husband that committed himself to this woman. As she stayed true to him, right? That's very important that both of them had to stay true to each other. Penelope, as you know, had many suitors and she avoided them skillfully for years, just as skillfully as Odysseus managed to construct a Trojan horse and get himself and some other Greek soldiers within the city of Troy that they could not conquer in any other way. So tuning may be necessary for subtle truths. We are not just dealing with something for which there is a technique, a recipe, a formula, but tuning, wisdom, subtlety, insight that may be needed. That's what we are talking about. All of those things, tuning, insight, recognition of subtle truth, is something that has almost vanished from our civilization. It is something we don't appreciate. It is something we associate with mythology, superstition, dubious religious sects, who knows what, Indian and Chinese wisdom of 2,000 years that's irrelevant for us today because we have science. Why would we need any nonsense like that? How do we come to this point? Very briefly. Obviously, we can spend days and months talking about it. I just want to call your attention to a few very interesting moments in the history of philosophy. And since we're talking about Platonism, let's start with Plato. In Plato's late dialogue, Theaetetus, Socrates, at what point they are inquiring about the nature of knowledge, and at Theaetetus, you may recall, and Socrates proposes there something that has been taken as almost the definition of knowledge or the best description of knowledge for more than 2,000 years. And Socrates says something like this: knowledge is a true belief that's justified by evidence, roughly. Okay? So you have a belief, that's one condition. That belief has to be true rather than false. If it's false, it's not knowledge. And there has to be some kind of justification, knowledge, evidence to support it, right? So otherwise you can have a true belief that's merely a guess, not a case of knowledge. Okay. So this is accepted as more or less a definition of knowledge for more than 2,000 years, until in 1963. An American philosopher, Edmond Gettier, wrote an article, "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" I think my recollection is that it's a 3-page article, and he had to do it while being in hospital because otherwise he wouldn't get the tenure. So a couple of his colleagues came to the hospital. I don't know why he was in the hospital, I don't remember, and begged him to write something, just to publish anything, to write anything so that they can support his case for tenure. And he did. And that became almost certainly the most quoted article of the 20th century philosophy. Why? Because Gettier managed in a 3-page article to show that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. He found some contra-examples to this, where you have all the conditions being satisfied, and you clearly, intuitively, you're not dealing with the case of knowledge. Okay, we're now going to discuss Gettier in more detail. If you have questions about it, I spent a lot of my postgraduate days and nights discussing the Gettier problem and trying to refute it or support it and so on. So I'll be glad to go back to my postgraduate days and recollect some of that. But I want to call your attention to another moment. So we're going a little bit back in history between Plato and Gettier, and that's Descartes, René Descartes. And the reason why it's important to mention Descartes is because Descartes transformed Western philosophy, or a better redirected philosophy, in many, many fundamental ways which is why he's called the father of modern philosophy. But I would like to call your attention to specifically one that's actually rarely mentioned, but I think maybe the most fundamental of all, besides the mind-body dualism. Namely, in the era before what we call modernity, modern philosophy, the truth is mostly being imagined as obtained by means of some kind of an insight or revelation, or in some cases that Plato liked to discuss, divine madness, an inspiration that is such that we become the vessels for a certain truth. Okay? We don't know, we don't understand ourselves what we are doing, as we believe that, say, artists of genius don't quite know what they're doing, and yet they produce something that's magnificent, that somehow reveals the true condition of the human race. So the truth was thought of as obtained by means of revelation of some kind. Okay, for instance, the Holy Book, the Holy Bible in our tradition, we have obtained by means of revelation. The people who actually wrote it, the text that we call the New Testament or the Old Testament, they themselves were again like vessels who, or it came to them like the prophets. Something comes to them, something speaks to you, and you reveal it, you bring it out to the world. But Descartes changed fundamentally. And what Francis Bacon started without Descartes, just before Descartes, just a little bit earlier, was to shift, to use Getty's language, to shift the emphasis from the condition of truth to the condition of justification or evidence. Okay, so all of a sudden, remember Descartes' meditations, the skeptic, the method of doubt. How do you know that you know? So Descartes is not believing, as you know, he doesn't want to be a skeptic, he wants to refute a skeptic, but he wants to have the knowledge of the world, true beliefs of the world that are based on evidence, that are based on justification. In fact, not just any evidence, but the evidence that would be irrefutable to any skeptical attempts. Okay? And again, later on in question and answer period, we can talk a little bit about why that was important and why that happened in Descartes and what happened in the world, meaning Europe, before Descartes to lead to that kind of transformation. But ever since Descartes, our civilization, our science, our philosophy are not focused on truth. They're focused on justification. They're focused on proofs. They're focused on evidence. So if we do a scientific experiment here in Cambridge, we expect that if the circumstances are similar, we should get the absolutely exact same results of that experiment that is performed in Japan, Madagascar, or Argentina, right? The method, the approach, the evidence, the objectivity of this all, rather than a revelation, some poetic inspiration, or things like that. Okay, that shifted our whole world from subtle truths toward facts, from deep insights toward evidence, toward proofs. And proofs and evidence have become the currency with which rational people operate, not the truth. Who knows the truth? And as you know from the history of science, can anybody ever say that any of the scientific theories is true? It's taken as true for a while before it's replaced by another scientific theory. The history of science is the history of pregnant errors. It's not the history of truth, or even an approximation to truth, even though there was a philosopher, Popper, who believed that, but of that a little bit later. So for Platonism and Transcendence, what is important is the recognition of something that's subtle, deeper than facts, deeper than evidence. Something that can be gained by much insight and wisdom, and sometimes with the help of God as well, with the help of spirits that would be on our side. But just as Homer explained it, We don't need any kind of divine madness for Penelope and Odysseus to recognize each other. We still know that in some moments of our lives, we recognize what is it that we really want, or we recognize that the person we are with is the true one for our hearts, right? Or the other way around, that's not a true person, that's not the one who we really want to spend the rest of our lives. So recognition is still possible in us, but it has been marginalized, vastly marginalized in our world. And what I'm urging you to do, if, as a way of supporting Platonism, is to revitalize the concept of recognition, to revitalize a way of getting beyond mere facts and beyond publicly available evidence, because subtle truths are always a little bit hidden. They're always a little bit covered up by the ordinary, by the dust of the ordinary life. Which brings us to the second moment that I want to discuss that is important both for Transcendence and Platonism. And that is, I would call it that way, I would use a little bit strange expression, the intrusion of the extraordinary into the ordinary. The intrusion of the extraordinary into the ordinary. What am I talking about here? Well, both Odysseus and Penelope were extraordinary persons. They were not ordinary in any way. And notice it's important that even Penelope is an extraordinary person. That we're talking about a completely patriarchal, male-dominated world, and yet Homer makes Penelope a very, very special person, a very extraordinary person. In case of Plato, he had another extraordinary person whom he followed for 10 years, and after whom he tried to model the remaining part of his life, and that's Socrates. Okay, and let's look a little bit about Socrates and why he was so important to Plato. And again, that's also something we can talk about the entire term. But I just want to point out your attention to maybe one or two moments. Remember that Socrates himself never claimed to have any deep revelation, recognition, that he didn't know anything. But Socrates had another magic. Socrates forced people out of complacency. Socrates forced people out of the well-trodden paths. Socrates made people uncomfortable. Socrates did not show to people what certain truth is, but he showed them how great is their ignorance. And that precisely and most often when we think that we know something, this is just a shallow, superficial, and for the most part, mistaken understanding of what virtue is, what happiness is, what good life is, and so on. Socrates, the extraordinary in the case of Socrates, is to take us out of our comfort zone, Okay, I can give you another examples of extraordinary that's also very Platonic, and that I'm sure Plato had in mind. Sometimes we see a person of an extraordinary beauty, right? And we just stop or just keep following how that person is walking by, not because we want to seduce that person or possess that person or necessarily even make acquaintance with that person. We are just fascinated by great beauty. Right? Or we see a beautiful sunset, or beautiful sunrise, or we see a beautiful landscape. And I come here to Cambridge. I think I can appreciate it more than you do who are used to it. For you, that's ordinary. For me, that's extraordinary. Right? And the extraordinary challenges us. It introduces different standards. Think about it. We live in a world of democracy, which is leveling. Every vote is equally valuable. We live in a world of money. Every monetary banknote is exactly the same, without identity, without anything extraordinary. We live in a world in which T.S. Eliot describes so aptly as the wasteland. The bulldozer of modernity has come and leveled everything. There are no caves and there are no skyscrapers. There's only a wasteland. Everybody is equal, and every piece of land is equal to anybody, any other, and every human being is equal to any other. Okay, Platonism suffocates in a world in which everything is equal. There is no room for Platonism in that world. Platonism needs something extraordinary, the good, the beautiful, the truth with a capital T, with a capital B, with a capital G. And not only that, it needs such extraordinary things, but what's more, it calls for us, it urges us to allow that extraordinary to guide our life, rather than the ordinary, rather than the average, rather than with what is taken as the measure of everything in our own life. Okay, so Platonism requires not only the existence of that extraordinary, and of course we can talk about what exactly is the ontological status of that extraordinary, and whether we have to be follow Plato strictly in assuming that that exists in another realm and so on. I'll come back to this. But what is important is this: the presence, the existence of the extraordinary, and the guiding role of the extraordinary in our life, so that we start to model our lives after the extraordinary rather than after the ordinary, after the average. Okay? So that's the second important moment in our trying to revitalize Platonism and the concept of transcendence, to see that the extraordinary is not only something that exists in fairy tales or Hollywood movies, but that this is present in our life, and just so obsessed and so focused on what is ordinary, we pass by it without noticing it. We are blind for it. We have blinded ourselves. Odysseus is dressed as a beggar, but our culture has turned itself into a beggar who's not capable of recognizing anything special, anything noble, anything extraordinary, anything beautiful without measure, without any human measure. So Platonism urges us to recognize that even in this world, even in this life, we can recognize things that are extraordinary. And we can find a way to appreciate them, to allow the extraordinary to be our standard, to be our measure, to allure us, to pull us toward itself, rather than to think, well, sure, I want to be an artist, but how much money would I make? How can I support my family or even myself by doing it? It's better to be a banker, no question about it, right? And so on. Okay, let me now finally talk a little bit more about the concept of transcendence, because it seems to me that the concept of transcendence is precisely introduced or relevant to explain the interaction between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Right? The word transcendence, the prefix trans, means reaching out, going beyond. And the word transcendence means connecting with something that is separated, or reconnecting something that doesn't seem to be obviously connected at all. Okay? And oftentimes, as you know, in our first association, and as a result of the long history of the Western civilization, is to think of the transcendent as outside of this world somehow, the otherworldly. Okay, the Christian church and the Christian theologians especially encourage that kind of understanding of the transcendence. There's a transcendent God, and he's not in space and time, and he's out of this world. Okay, but that by no means is the only interpretation of transcendence. And as a matter of fact, I would very much discourage that kind of understanding of transcendence. Transcendence may be in this world, just not connected with this world properly. It can be disconnected, partially because of our blindness, partially because of our lack of cultivation of values, lack of insight, lack of recognition, that it is right here and right now. And we pass by it without seeing it, without noticing, without recognizing it. Plato somewhat also seduced us to think about that transcendent as being far away because of the allegory of the cave, right? Most of us are trapped in a cave, and somebody, some lucky prisoner, is allowed to escape from that cave into different realm of reality and see things as they are, see things in their glory, and so on. Recently, a number of attempts have been made to revitalize the concept of transcendence. And one person who's done a marvelous job in doing so, and with whose work I hope you are familiar, at least to a certain extent, is Roger Scruton. Scruton usually uses the word transcendental rather than transcendent. He was a scholar of Kant, and Kant makes that distinction. Transcendent is something that is disconnected from experience, independent from experience. And transcendental is something that is a priori, and yet it functions in a way that makes that experience possible. So it is kind of both disconnected and connected from experience, and which is important for Scruton. Scruton writes about the concept of transcendental in many ways and forms, but maybe the most beautiful example of his writing about transcendence is the phrase the transcendental bond. The transcendental bond. What does he mean by that? That's a strange phrase. You cannot find something like that directly, probably in Platonism or in Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition. Thinking about a world in which the laws or the regulations or the rules or something that binds us together are just human conventions. They're social contracts, as Hobbes and Rousseau call them. Okay, marriage between Odysseus and Penelope is a social contract, right? It's done in a civil court, not maybe in a church of some kind, in a temple of some kind, but it's what it is, right? And when people are not happy together, they break that social contract. They decide to renounce that social contract. For Odysseus and Penelope, marriage is not a social contract. It's the deepest bond of their life. It's the ultimate commitment that they have, that the human being can have to another human being. If you recall the previous portions of the Odyssey, in his travels from Troy to Ithaca, Odysseus was not, should I say, fully faithful. And Odysseus had a chance to stay with semi-goddesses and goddesses. He could enjoy the eternal youth, at least of his partners, if not of himself. Instead, Odysseus wants to return, leaves these divine or semi-divine creatures, and he goes back to his middle-aged wife, Penelope. Why? What a fool, right? What a fool. What an idiot. What is the matter with him? And what is the matter with Homer, right? So it's nice to have an adventure. It's nice to be with somebody young and beautiful and everlasting and so on. But that's not his wife. That's not somebody who's part of him, part of his identity, part of his very being, right? To be true to yourself, you have to be also true to that being to which you're committed in a vow that's way beyond the social contract and civil marriage, right? What I'm trying to do is to interpret the concept of transcendence, not in terms of something that's otherworldly, but on the contrary, something that is the most intimate, something that is our ultimate commitment, something that is the most sacred to us, so that we can never ever violate it, or so that we don't ever want to compromise it. Scruton understands it somewhat in the same way. He uses these words, what is sacred, what is the most sacred, what we are ready to sacrifice for, right? So Odysseus has to sacrifice all these little Barbies that he meets along the way to Ithaca, and come back to his middle-aged wife, Penelope. And he's happy to do that, right? Maybe he doesn't always see it quite clearly that way, but at the end, the truth prevails. At the end, the light comes to him, and he knows what he has to do. So think of it, I want you to think about it once more. The transcendent is something that can be reconnected, or better, disconnected from our lives. It's something that we can forget about, as Odysseus occasionally forgets about it during his journey, right? But this is something with which, if we are to be true to ourselves, with which we have to reconnect, because that is the ultimate source of our values. That commitment is the ultimate source of our values and the ultimate measure of our identity, of who I am, of who we are. Okay? So transcendence does not have to be somewhere in sky or in another world, and definitely not out space and time. Transcendence could be right here and right now, if we could only recognize it. Yeah. Let me mention in connection with this one more beautiful element of the story of Odysseus and Penelope, which kind of almost suggests that. Some of you would recall that Odysseus and Penelope had a very unusual bed. You remember that their bed chamber was quite extraordinary. Remember, we're talking about the extraordinary things. So not only that Odysseus and Penelope were extraordinary, but their bed chamber was extraordinary. How extraordinary? Well, I see some of you are nodding, so you recall that Odysseus actually used the existing tree, didn't cut the tree to build the house, to build a bedroom, but used the tree and the trunk of the tree, and I assume some branches, to build the bed there, to use the, notice what it implies. It implies a couple of things that are very important for Homer, that are very important for Scruton, and that I think are very important for Plato. The tree is the symbol of nature. House is the symbol of civilization. Okay? Oftentimes, we misguidingly, mistakenly believe that to be civilized is to suppress nature, to repress nature, to eliminate nature, and impose something artificial. Well, in doing so, we only provide a substitute, a counterfeit, but not the real thing. So Homer, Scruton, and I believe also Plato would think that we have to build on nature, that we have to cultivate nature, not eliminate nature, not suppress nature. Okay, and that connection is not so much contained, preserved in our culture, but it is preserved in another word that's as old as culture, perhaps even older: agriculture. What is the agriculture? It's the cultivation of land. It's not the destruction of land. You look at the soil, you look at the quality of the soil, and that tells you what to plant there. You don't want to plant figs that are never going to go ripe in a climate like this, but you want to plant something that will grow, like apples or something else, or some industrial product. So we have to take into account the nature of nature. We have to understand what gifts nature have and what gifts nature does not have. I have 3 children. I have to take into account who they are if I want to give them a suggestion about their life and what to do, rather than to impose one uniform rule. Okay, you're all going to be journalists or bankers or musicians or whatever. This is my wishful thinking, but that's how we are behaving. Be realistic. find a job that pays well, regardless of what you're gifted for and what you're not gifted for. You see, to stay in connection with nature is a necessary condition of being true to ourselves. There is no other way to be. Everything else is substitute, artificial, something that's superimposed on nature, trying to repress nature. So transcendence is something that wants to reconnect us with our roots, reconnects us with what is the most primordial. But built on that, nature is the first word, but nature is not the last word. But it has to be the first word. It has to be where we start from. Back to Odysseus and Penelope and their bed chamber. Plato used the metaphor of a cave, a prison, essentially. The bed chamber, after Odysseus left, was the cave and the prison for Penelope. She was contained in it. But when Odysseus returns, and when Penelope tests him and suggests to their nurse to remove the bed, to make the bed that Odysseus made outside of the chamber, and of course Odysseus knows that that cannot be done if it's the same bed that he made, that bed chamber becomes the temple. It becomes the sacred place at which the two of them reunite, at which they recognize each other for who they truly are, and where they renew their vow. Homer uses even a beautiful poetic metaphor. She said that the goddess Athena, who constantly followed and for the most part helped Odysseus, puts such a thick layer of night over their chamber and over Ithaca that that night lasted much, much longer, so that Odysseus and Penelope can truly reconnect with each other, that can truly recognize each other, and can truly achieve that transcendence within immanence. So the bed chamber, this is an interesting metaphor that I want you to think about, that the same place can both be a prison and a temple and a sacred ground. The same place. Without Odysseus being true to his wife, it's a prison for Penelope. With Odysseus over there, coming with a pure heart and good heart and true intentions, it becomes a temple. It becomes the most sacred ground that the two of them have to protect. So this is, for us, we cannot, we are so much into the subjects, individuals, persons, that we cannot recognize Platonism or respect and revitalize Platonism without taking that into account. We are the children of modern and postmodern age, for better and for worse. So the story that I was trying to give you is exactly how to do that, how not to abandon our personality, how not to neglect our subjectivity, but how to connect that, how to ground that subjectivity in nature, in the real world, in the world we did not make, in a world which we cannot fully control. There's a way to reconnect the person and the subject and the object. And in a sense, I think the story of that bed chamber and the way that I'm pushing this concept of transcendence is essentially the overcoming of the subject-object dichotomy that has so haunted, especially the modern philosophy in the last several centuries. So here we are, time to sum it up. So the question is, in our anti-metaphysical time, anti-Platonistic time, should we just reject Platonism, as most people are willing to do, or should we find a way, can we find a way to revitalize it, to make it a force in our life, to make it something that will serve as an inspiration? I offered you 3 moments, 3 elements, by means of fear, and they are recognition, the extraordinary and the ordinary, and the transcendence understood as our deepest commitments that allow us to see not only that Platonism is possible, in our world, but to what extent Platonism can become a guiding star again. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for that very rich and stimulating paper. So, questions? Christoph?
Yeah, I love that so much. And I was just wondering, you know, when we talk about the revitalization of Platonism or transcendence even, I'm wondering what role can be attributed to experience or the lack of experiential content. To give an example, I was recently reading a later piece by William James in which he kind of discarded Plotinus a little bit, saying that like the monism of a metaphysical kind uses too much experience to make its case. And I'm wondering if we're lacking in the right experiences that would make us believe in transcendence and believe in the sacred and things like that.
That's a very good question. I think the role of experience is essential. Not only that we can dispense, but on the contrary, we should not dispense with experience. I will mention two, let's say, books or two authors that can help you there. Well, yeah, there are at least two or three easily that come to mind. But let me try to explain the idea first. One thing that's happening at that time with Bacon and Descartes and the modern shift toward evidence and proofs is turning away from experience, not so much for Bacon, but for Descartes, right? For Descartes. What Descartes does is a thought experiment. What if there's an evil demon? What if I'm dreaming? How do I know that I'm not dreaming? But think about one better moment here in Cambridge, and we're better to talk about it than that. Newton, the law of gravitation. People knew of gravitation always, but nobody ever took it very, very seriously. You know why? Because gravitation is something that pulls down, that weights things down, was always associated with our spiritual experience of things, that everything that goes down is low, is evil. What pulls us down? This Platonism too. What's good lifts us up. What is good elevates us. The evil things draw. There is hell at the bottom of whatever it is, right? So notice, for centuries, people were actually trying to avoid everything that pulls us down. They associated with evil, with sin, with guilt, with bad things, with inertia, and so on. So what happened? The Reformation happened. Calvin and Luther happened. The conviction, the teaching that human nature is evil, that human nature is sinful, that's who we are, that's normal, that's not extraordinary, that's ordinary. Each one of us is just a spinner, and there can be no help to that. So all of a sudden, it was possible to kind of, it was so accepted and taken for granted that Newton could detach the spiritual part and the empirical part of it, and talk about gravitation as a force, which also comes from religious experience, from, as Emil Durkheim, a sociologist, tried to show, from the word mana. When Newton talks about force, and when you read Newton, he admits that he doesn't know how the contact happens at a distance. And he was accused, the first critics of Newton accused him of introducing occult properties into things, right? And Newton says, I don't know how it's happening, but it's happening. And to kind of justify himself, Newton starts finding the mathematical formulas by means of which he can show and demonstrate that gravitation indeed is happening, and with certain regularity. And that shifts the whole science away from experience, from personal experience. Look at Newton's Principia. Not once does he talk about what kind of feelings do we have when gravitation happens, when we are falling down. There's no word feeling, there's no word emotion, there's no word experience. All there is an attempt to put it into mathematical formulas. So we're shifting from experience to abstraction. Our science is the science of abstraction. We believe in abstractions more than we believe in our experience. But when I see a very beautiful woman walking by me, or hear a beautiful piece of music, or come to Cambridge and I can't walk or breathe or talk because I'm astonished by its beauty, it's my experience, it's my feelings. I'm feeling elevated in the presence of some of greatness like that. How else do you feel that besides your experience, besides your intellect and your emotions and your heart and your mind and your soul and everything you have being involved? So if you're talking about experience, it's something that integrates our faculties and allows us to function as whole beings rather than statistical units and abstractions, then yes, experience is indeed phenomenally important. I'll just draw a few names and you can do your readings on your own. One is Ortega y Gasset, Jose Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish philosopher, much neglected, for whom the concept of experience is absolutely primary. Much neglected, but a beautiful writer and an important writer, the 20th century, good portion of the first half of the 20th century. The second is Theodore Roszak, an American psychologist, philosopher, R-O-S-Z-O-K, Theodore Roszak, who, for instance, wrote a book, one book that's called Where Does the Wasteland End? And he talks about the concept of transcendence there extensively. His other book is Person Planet, Person-Planet. He thinks that the personal crisis we are undergoing through and the planetary ecological crisis are pretty much the same. We have killed the soul in nature and we have killed the soul in us. We have killed the best in us and we are killing the best in nature. We are using to work in your cubicle for 40 years to make enough money. You don't have to be imaginative, you don't have to be creative, you don't have to have a soul. You have to be as efficient as a machine. The same thing in nature, right? So here's the third one. Let me mention one more fantastic author who's totally unjustly neglected in Western civilization. He used to be professor at Boston University. His name is Kohak, Erasim Kohak, spelled as K-O-H-O-K. Born Czech, but lived in the United States and then returned to Czech. He has a book that should be a must read. It's called The Embers and the Stars. The Embers and Stars, published in, let's say, 1986, if my memory is correct. What Kohak did after his disappointing second marriage, he bought himself a property in the state of Vermont, up north in the United States, beyond the power line, no electricity, no roads, and he lived there. And he reconnected with nature. He recognized nature, and he recognized to what extent nature and spirituality need each other. And he comes up, much of what I was talking about in terms of the extraordinary and the ordinary comes from him, is inspired by him, except he calls it the eternal and the temporal. He's pissed off with the philosophers who, following mindlessly Heidegger, just talk about how temporal we are and how being is time and all that nonsense. And he wants us to reconnect us with spatial metaphors, because our problem is that we are homeless. Now, our problem is not that we don't know what time it is and that we are going to die. Our problem is, like Odysseus has to find home. The metaphor of home is still crucial. We have to find our place in this world. We have to feel that we are not strangers, that we're not lost, that we're not so disoriented. So Kohak is trying to revitalize the spatial metaphor and how to live with where we are and how to live with nature. But let's give a chance to other people to ask a question. Yes.
My name is Vishal. I'm doing a PhD in sociology. It's very fascinating. I was wondering, how can you reconcile wonder or awe with the notion of transcendence?
Well, how can you not connect them? They're essentially connected, right? Mm-hmm. That's what Plato said, that everything begins with wonder. Philosophers like Ortega and Kohak would say with wonder and love. Because not only that you wonder at the beauty of the world, you love it. you're moved by it, you're attracted to it, right? That's what love is, attraction. That's the force that pulls you towards it, rather than a force that separates you from that world so that you live in abstraction, so that you live detached from that world. So that's what we need. So that's that transcendence that's not outside, that's inside. Right? So by means of wonder, we go beyond shallow facts and we go toward the recognition of beauty, subtlety in nature, and so on. So for instance, Kohak thought that the moral norms are kind of already implicit in nature. If you follow the rhythms of nature, the order of nature, and this is essentially what we have to do. I mean, think about our when we eat, not when we should, in accordance with nature. When do we sleep? How much do we sleep? We have disconnected ourselves from the natural cycles, from the natural. So part of what we have to do is to reconnect with the natural cycles and then build on that again. And we really have more peace, more sense of harmony, more sense of belonging. How can we belong to this world when we are violating every cycle of nature, for instance?
Good question here.
Yeah.
I love this talk, especially since it's super related to my thesis that I'm doing for my MPhil. And I'm studying Zizek, and he talks about like Christian atheism. And I love the idea of immanent transcendence in a sense, because I think he bases his whole theory on this. And in his book, he talks about
Which one?
The monstrosity of Christ. He talks about Chesterton, the theologian, and Chesterton gives an example about what does it mean for what is the highest good that you can reach, and he says it's orthodoxy. It's that the fact that the trains arrive on time, the fact that the people who go to church keep going after 50 years every Sunday, every single Sunday at the same time, saying the same stuff, etc. And for me, I think he says that this is the miracle in itself. And does that is that an example of a localized transcendence or like an immanent transcendence? I was curious to know about
Sure,
that.
it is the example. I'm going to meet on Friday a couple of people who were volunteers in Africa, working for Albert Schweitzer, his hospital, fell in love over there when they were young, 21. They're still married, and they're still as much as in love with each other as probably they were, in a very different way, because love has to grow, love has to change. It's certainly not that physical passion that I'm sure they had in their 20s. But that is the beauty of the world, that the two people can stay together rather than look at our world. The divorce rate is 50%. What does marriage vow mean to us? It's a social contract. It's my convenience, and when it becomes inconvenient, I want a divorce. I want out. I don't have a commitment. And transcendence means commitment, being committed and being sure, first of all, that there is something that is sacred for us. Right? The anti-Platonic and the anti-metaphysical world are the world in which people laugh at the concept of the sacred. The concept of sacred, they say, belongs to, it's a superstition of the naive mythological age. We don't need the concept of the sacred. But how do you live your life if nothing is sacred in it, except maybe for money? How do you live your life in which nothing is sacred? What guides you? At the end, Odysseus comes back to Ithaca because of Penelope, right? Because he's drawn back to his wife, he's drawn back to that woman, who of course is much older, 20 years older, but it is his wife. So we have to find that transcendence in our world. If we just keep praying to an absent God, we know where that ends and how that finishes, right? We get frustrated because that God does not seem to recognize us or has any time for us, and then we are angry with God and we are angry with ourselves and so on. So finding the sacred here and now, finding the sacred in our world, recognizing what is essential for our lives. That's another concept that's expelled from this world, anti-Platonistic, the concept of essence, the concept of something that makes you be who you are, right? We live in a plastic world. We can turn plastic into anything we want. Take a piece of plastic and tell me what you want me to do with it, and I'll make it for you, okay? We are not plastic. We have dispositions, we have gifts, we have feelings. We cannot be turned into plastic papers and forks and spoons. We need something more stable than that.
We have another question, but before you raise your question, I just want to ask about Roger Scruton and your reference to Roger Scruton. And by the way, the Ulysses or the Odysseus motif is partly Neoplatonic. Of course, the Neoplatonists used it as an image of the soul and the soul's return. But I knew Roger fairly well and discussed, in a way, his philosophy of religion with him. And I tried to get him to admit that he was a sort of Platonist. And Roger was very reluctant. And in fact, he criticizes me for it in print, but at one point. But and my concern was that if he's putting such a stress on the sacred, there must be something that makes the sacred sacred, right? And that was the problem, it seemed to me, that because of his extreme Kantianism, he didn't want to make certain ontological commitments.
Yes.
That seemed to me, if he wanted to move beyond the sort of Durkheimian position,
Yes.
right, that the sacred is basically to do with social factors, he needed that extra move. Now, when you're talking about transcendence and immanence, I wonder whether this is a sort of proximity with Roger, or I mean, in Roger's case, of course, it was a kind of Kantian.
I would say it's not. In that regard, I think I deviate from him, because Kant, as you know, would build it on what's a priori, what's kind of out there, built in somehow by the structure of the mind and so on. This is where I think my concept of recognition plays a role. I don't always, it doesn't have to be ready-made over it, but I do recognize a person as somebody who I want to be my soulmate, who is my soulmate, and who I want to be my soulmate for the rest of my life. I do recognize my calling to become a philosopher or to become a poet. I do come to recognize, so it's partially there, but there's a lot of work to be done on my part too. Rather than in Kant, it's there and it acts automatically the moment I start cognizing. So I put far more shift on our individual, personal gifts and dispositions in the recognition of what's sacred, and allow it to differ vastly for some people, even though at the end we come to the concept of home, to the concept of the love of your life, or soulmate, or friends, and things. Roger uses a bond between mother and child, you remember, in many of his books. In a sense, you don't use your child, you don't choose your child. The child is born to you, but the child certainly doesn't chooses a mother, but somehow the bond is being created between the two that's lasting, and that's not plastic.
Sure, that seems to be right. But if you're, let's take my point about Roger, that he's stressing the sacred, but it's unclear what actually makes the sacred sacred. Now, when you're talking about the transcendent in the immanent, don't you have a similar problem? I mean, one of the, obviously, I take it that there's a mistake in modeling transcendence on remoteness. And that, for the classical model of transcendence, is precisely the point, that that utter transcendence, which of course is a non-corporeal transcendence, non-remoteness,
Right.
is compatible with radical immanence. So, in an experience of beauty or goodness or truth, you recognize an image of something that is immutable and eternal, and human greed and misery can't destroy that is eternal and immutable. So there is that element of genuine transcendence shining through in the immanence. Very much inherent.
Yes, but there's more, because I started with the story of Penelope, and this is, it is, there's an element of that's common to, let's say, any kind of genuinely respected, deeply respected marriage vow, but the two of them make that commitment to each other. You and I would probably not be so fascinated by Penelope, or maybe it would be like the suitors. Maybe we want the kingdom, or but you see, the two of them find each other and their relationship sacred. But it seems we all have to be looking for home, place we could call home, find a way to feel in certain harmony with nature, with our environment. But how exactly that happens, where that happens, that's partially due to our own gifts and dispositions and abilities and our personalities. And so in a sense, in my story, to call it that way, there's a lot more responsibility on each of us, rather than in a traditional story. You're just introduced into the Church of England, and you believe in the God of the Church of England, and that, or your country, and that's your sacred things. You're born here and you're cultivated here. It's different. It's not just enough where you were born in, but who do you recognize? Who do you recognize to be your soulmate? What do you recognize to be your sacred call? To help others and be a nurse or a doctor, or to find a way for that burst of creativity out of you in form of poetry or painting or music or something like that. So there's more. That's where this modern element is also part of the story, rather than the traditional element where we are chosen. There's destiny. The gods have decided for us, and they guide us.
Right. So I might end up asking the same question just in a different term, but I have my own way of phrasing it. So it's sort of a two-barrel question. Firstly, what's the role of like mystery in establishing the sense of the deeper truths behind the sort of surface truths? And secondly, does this sense of mystery ultimately entail then an otherworldly orientation? Like if I see sort of my love for my beloved as something fundamentally mysterious, then it doesn't seem like it can be something that can be constrained, not even within my experience, right? Because my experience is constrained by time, by place, by all this kind of contingency that I really want to exceed if I actually want to love my beloved. So it seems that there is a sense in which you must depart the world in order to gain.
Sure. Good questions. The concept of mystery has two aspects, the negative and the positive. The negative aspect stands in sharp opposition to what I was criticizing the whole evening, the average, the ordinary, the statistical, the facts, and so on. So mystery is something that's of a different kind. Mystery is something that cannot be reduced to statistical numbers and so on. The positive aspect of mystery is a problem because its range is so widely, depending on what mystical tradition you're talking, being unified with God or being unified with nature and so on. Let me give you a fairly short answer to a very complex question, and I thought about it a lot, and I think every true Platonist has to allow room for mystery to a certain extent, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be Platonism. Let me call your attention to someone who also did, at least a portion of his life lived here, C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, most of you know him for his wonderful Chronicles of Narnia. but he wrote the works of nonfiction too. And I want to call your attention particularly to one short little book that's very much worth reading. It's called The Abolition of Man. So C.S. Lewis was concerned that somehow in this materialistic scientific craziness and pursuit of money and so on, that we are abandoning man, that we are either reducing man to something that man is not, or destroying the best in man and so on. And C.S. Lewis, somewhere in the first 20 pages of that book, depending on the edition, C.S. Lewis says something like that: transcendence is Tao. Transcendence is Tao. Okay? Judging by what your roots may be, I think you should be familiar with Taoism and Lao-Tzu and Chuang-Tzu. And the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. So what is C.S. Lewis saying? That it's very difficult, if not impossible or mistaken, to try to give a definition of transcendence or of mystery. It is a Tao. It is something that permeates the whole of reality. It is something that is in some ways like the Platonic forms that we both can know and can never really know. We can see them, we can glance them, and the impression is so strong that it should guide our soul through the whole cycle and many, many more cycles to come. But ultimately, it's not something to analyze, to dissect, to define. It is a mystery, and it has to be accepted as such. And it's enough that it creates that kind of an impression. Just like when I see a beautiful woman, I don't have to possess her, I don't have to control, I don't have to know her name, I don't have to ask her for her phone number. It is enough to see that kind of beauty and allow that radiance to come to you, that positive energy to spread, and maybe to ask yourself, how can somebody be that beautiful? How's that kind of beauty even possible? Right? That's mystery, that's transcendence. So don't try to squeeze it into a box of any kind. Don't try to label it. That's what C.S. Lewis is, right? It's a Tao. Let it flow. A Tao, the most essential thing is how it flows, right? We float. Freely detached, we're not part of this world. But Taoism is not about floating without control, but flowing together with the rest of the world, finding a way to be part of the stream that goes where it should go, rather than to resist that stream and say, we are in charge, I have a remote control. I don't want the water to flow this way, I want it to flow that way, right? Because I want to produce electric power or whatever and make money. So we are violating that Tao. We are not living in harmony with that Tao. So the way I understand Platonism and transcendence is to find a way to flow with that Tao, to be sensitive, to use more than scientific evidence, to use our imagination, to use our feelings, to use everything we have, our souls, to feel it. That's experience too. You cannot have that experience without feeling it, rather than simply recording it with your machine, with your measuring instrument, and having the digits that are showing you the temperature out there. Feel it. Is it cold? Is it windy? Is it pleasant? Or is it unpleasant? Yes. Yeah.
Oh, last question. Oh, maybe not, but I was emboldened by your fantastic question as a fellow critical appreciator of Zizek. And when you mentioned the intrusion of the extraordinary into the ordinary, the first thing that came to mind, obviously, was, as a student of theology, Jesus Christ. What place does ugliness and monstrosity have in the revival of the spirit of Platonism? Because that's precisely what makes Jesus extraordinary, is that the cross is horrific, and it's not attractive, not something that we love, but it's repulsive. And isn't this kind of, this is kind of why I appreciate it. This is kind of Zizek's point as well. This is the word for people who don't know anything about beauty or who are homeless. It's a promise to them, right? So what role does, I love the talk, but this is the place, this is the only
cross
little
was
place.
horrific. The crucifixion is horrific. And Socrates was also described as beautiful or as ugly, as the ugliest of all people, right?
And Nietzsche as well.
Yes, and if you want to read a literature that will shake your soul, one person to read is Dostoevsky, and that's not a beautiful world. The Brothers Karamazov is an ugly, ugly world, a dysfunctional family of a father that's no father. And some people said that Dostoevsky was thinking about another father when he was writing about the father Karamazov. And again, to connect it with Roger Scruton and some of these people who I mentioned, there is no appreciation of mystery. There is no recognition of transcendence and something that's supremely good without suffering, without experiencing pain, without experiencing ugliness. Much of Odyssey is not pretty at all. I mean, think about how many men he loses on his way to Ithaca. Virtually everybody, right? I forget if it was 12 ships or 10 ships that went from Troy to Ithaca. I mean, his best sailors, and there's so much loss, and there's so much, and there are lies, and there are deceptions, and there's murder of the Cyclops, and I mean, there's much that's not pretty there at all. A blind Homer could see and know that ugliness has to be part of our soul. Nietzsche says, "What doesn't destroy us makes us stronger." I'm not suggesting that we should be martyrs and should be torturing ourselves. I'm not in favor, especially not of radical asceticism, but some appreciation of what a trial life really is, and how often it hits us or hits those who are totally innocent. It's something horrific, whether it's disease or war. Look at the world in which we live now. Do you still dare to watch the news? I'm addicted. I cannot stop, even though it makes me feel like I will vomit after watching the news. And yet somehow in this chaos, that's our world, in this wasteland, we have to ask the question with Roja, where does the wasteland end? And how do we find something in here that will, I mean, think about the situation with Penelope. There are these 125 or however many suitors who are after her over there, who don't call her Penelope the wife of Odysseus, they call her Penelope, the daughter of, and then the name of her father, who disrespect her, who don't treat her for what she is, a married woman. Right? There's ugliness. They're there to feast and to eat and so on. Right? There's much ugliness in all of that. And remember what I also said about the bedchamber that could be both a prison and a sacred place. So ugliness and beauty cannot be fully separated. That could be only an artificial world. That's only happening in the utopias that have no chance of any reality. They can only delude us when we are that innocent or that naive. So somehow transcendence, Platonism, and the best in us have to be recognized in this world that leads us so often to despair, rather than to wonder about it and look forward to another day. If we have done it. Yeah.
Cheers, thank you. I really enjoyed that talk. Thank you. I was just curious as to the Eastern Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann said that anyone who's capable of thanksgiving is capable of salvation. And he spoke a lot about the wasteland of modernity. It got me thinking that it strikes me kind of modern Western society, generally speaking, is very sort of incapable of thanksgiving, in the sense of no money's ever enough, no house is ever big enough, no car is ever fast enough, so on and so forth. And I was wondering, do you think there's a relationship between thanksgiving and the transcendent?
Sure. I mean, you pretty much explained it yourself. there's another book that I was mentioning, some nice books. I want to mention one more, which is one of my personal favorites. It's by an Englishman, Dudley Young, with Y-O-U-N-G, who was a professor of English literature, but was a philosopher. The book is called The Origins of the Sacred. Another book that's hardly known, but extraordinary. And he thinks that perhaps one of the fundamental metaphysical impulses in all of us is that as big is beautiful, and that we always want something bigger, faster, more. And perhaps what we're talking about, especially in terms of commitment, think about Odysseus. What's the most beautiful about him is not how many women he slept with on way back and whether he could have slept with another 25, but that he finds his way to the true one, to his true wife, right? So we almost, there's also a book that's called by Schumacher called Small is Beautiful. How do we recognize also that beauty is not in another world? The grass is always greener. How do we recognize and find a way that to be happy with our imperfect lawn and say that this is home, that this is where I belong, this is where I want to be. So how to be happy with what we have and discover that beauty and transcendence right here and right now. That's the phrase, that rather than to be chasing another record or chasing more money and higher salary and promotion and so on. So we spend our lives chasing some ghosts, imaginary ghosts, and thinking, well, if not in this world, God will reward me in another world, and so on. So we're always chasing something rather than to look around. This is what wonder is being placed in this world. Wonder is staying here and noticing the subtlety and beauty of this world, despite its ugliness, somehow, despite its imperfection.
Well, maybe this is an appropriate time to thank our speaker for a wonderfully rich and stimulating paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you.